I think we have a good cohort assembled today. Thank you, everyone, colleagues, for joining today's Baringa webinar focused on hydrogen and the role it will play in Texas's future energy system. My name is David Shepard, and I'm a partner with Baringa's North American Energy and Resources Strategy Practice. I'm pleased to share the stage today with industry thought leaders who are at the forefront of defining and executing complex energy transition pathways around the world. So I will keep my introductory comments brief so you can hear from the real experts. In my case, I've spent 35 years now working on the energy transition. At various times of that journey, I've been intrigued by the possibilities for hydrogen, but never really had a view for how it could have a meaningful impact at scale. And it's interesting, everyone these days seems to be talking about the energy transition. It's certainly on vogue in many LinkedIn profiles and certainly amongst many of the attendees today that span the attendees for this webinar that span the development community, finance and infrastructure companies, equipment producers, regulators, consultants. Everyone seems to want a piece of the energy transition. Technically, though, we've been through no less than 4 energy transitions in my career. The first really focused on the liberalization of gas and power markets. The second drove technical innovation in horizontal fracturing to drive massive economic advantages and created expanded global markets for energy. The third one, that most recent one, has driven down the cost of renewable technologies at scale. And now we're really in the 4th inning of the energy transition, where we've got the opportunity to put all of those pieces together towards a much greater purpose. And that's the decarbonization of industries well beyond the traditional energy sector. And sitting smack in the middle of the action of that energy transition is the universe's smallest element. Our perspective from Baringa, informed by decades of research, analysis, and modeling, is that energy markets paint a bright future for hydrogen and stitching those prior transitions together. For the last 18 months, Baringa has been working closely with an organization called the Hydrogen Council, which is a leading cross-industry collaboration and advocacy group championing and demystifying the role and pathway initiatives that will underpin confident investment in hydrogen. This is spanning, traditional energy companies, manufacturers, industrial companies, heavy energy users. They're a broad constituency that has come together within that group. If you're not familiar with them, check them out at www.hydrogencouncil.com. I'm pleased to introduce as one of our speakers today, Daryl Wilson, Executive Director of the Hydrogen Council. Daryl will be kicking off our discussion, and then he'll be followed by my colleagues and hydrogen experts Shane Heffernan and Nina Fay, who are experts on European, US, and broader global energy markets, and then by Molly Iliff, Baringa's global hydrogen market lead. In our discussion today, we're going to give a brief overview of some of the work from Hydrogen Council, and then we'll talk about some of the investment impacts from the US Inflation Reduction Act, what investment scale we can expect within the broader hydrogen ecosystem, and specifically within the Texas and Gulf Coast regions. And then lastly, we'll talk about the total system benefits that hydrogen can provide. So without any further ado, Daryl, the stage is yours.
Thanks very much, Dave. It's a real pleasure to be with you today. I'm Daryl Wilson, Executive Director of the Hydrogen Council, and I'm going to just give you a little bit background on a very important project that we started almost 2 years ago with Baringa and help you understand why we chose Baringa to do this work with us. As Dave mentioned, the Hydrogen Council is a cross-sectoral organization spanning the globe and includes most of the major leaders and technology suppliers for hydrogen technology around the world. So it's a very interesting mix. The representatives on the council are the CEOs of these organizations. So we work right from the top of these organizations to develop strategy and vision and full understanding of what hydrogen can do. And this work that we've done with Baringa is a critical part of that. Next. I'm going to start with just a few slides. If we go to the next slide, a few slides just summarizing some of the recent findings of the council. In May, we released this report showing 1,040 projects valued at $320 billion US. So hydrogen's not kind of a little demonstration project off to the side anymore. You can see across the bottom, there are 112 gigascale production projects, 553 projects focused on large-scale industrial use of hydrogen, and a heavy concentration of these in Europe because there's been some time for Europe to develop a project portfolio. But the US is coming very quickly now, supported by IRA. Let's look at the next slide for just another couple of views on the data that the council has. Here, where one of our other models is to look at the potential trade flows for hydrogen. So hydrogen is going to be a molecule that helps us move things around the world. And on the next slide, we'll see that it's not just about pure hydrogen gas, but actually the derivatives of hydrogen. And this is where the analysis gets a little bit more interesting and complicated. So alongside hydrogen and piping hydrogen gas or liquid hydrogen, there's methanol, synthetic kerosene, ammonia, green steel. All of these are derivatives from the hydrogen molecule as it lends decarbonization power to the world. On the next slide, finally, just a summary of these reports, which you can find on the Hydrogen Council website. So we've been looking at cost and technology evolution, the various applications and how competitive they are. We've offered up a vision for how hydrogen helps us to get to net zero. And that contribution is expected to be in the vicinity of 20% of final energy use by 2050. And then, of course, there are many policy aspects that are emerging, not the least of which IRA in the US. So now I want to go on the next slide to a little bit more about the project. We said to ourselves, this is probably going to be one of the most complex things we've ever tried to do, and we need the right partner to work with us. So recognizing all of the complexity of hydrogen and the role that it has in the energy system, we wanted to model a whole system view because our consideration is many of the problems that we have in the energy world is kind of that segmentation of electricity, gas, liquid fuels, and kind of the three solitudes, as I call them. And hydrogen has a tremendous integrative role when it comes to the energy system of the future. And many of the benefits are system benefits, so they're very hard to quantify. And we look to Baringa as a partner to start to unpack this complex roster of benefits from hydrogen. And we said to them, listen, our view is that hydrogen gets to about 20% penetration, but we have no concrete idea of how this actually works in time and space. And we think that the energy system architects and designers of the future need to have a clear picture and better understanding of how all this works from a systemic point of view, and hence the need for Baringa and the modeling work. On the following slide, a bit of a summary of the main purposes that we set out to follow. So we wanted an understanding for system designers in the energy world to have more efficient integration of renewables, better system reliability and resilience, two very important words for Texas, by the way. We wanted to quantify the benefits, so how much decarbonization with what cost and what energy impact. And all of this would necessarily be tied up in a very, very complex model. So we started to shop the world as to who does this kind of thing. I remember I've been on this journey in hydrogen for 16 years now. And I remember on a whiteboard in my company sort of diagramming out, somebody has to show how all this works as a whole system. And for many, many years, I could never find that was even possible to do. But 2 years ago, when we set out our investigation with the Hydrogen Council, we found Baringa. And together, we then conceived of this project that they're going to share some of the results from later in the presentation today. To simplify our approach, we decided that we break down the world into 3 exemplar regions. So we couldn't take on the whole world at once. So we said West Central Europe is a complex market design and a very rich policy environment. So it's one rendition of how all these pieces are going to come together. And then Texas, there's a very rich mix of renewables, conventional energy, and frankly, the largest production base of hydrogen in the world with 42 steam methane reforming plants. So Texas is already a hydrogen-rich environment. And then finally, we look to the nation of Japan, which is an island and entirely depends on imports of its energy. And we said, we wonder how all those pieces go together in that islanded context. So that's the reason why we narrowed our scope to these 3 regions. So on the next slide, just a few comments around the US before we get into the meat of the presentation with our team from Baringa today. When you look at the US and North America, I'm speaking to you, in fact, from Canada, so that's why I've got us on the map as well. In the green, you see the renewable energy resource profile. In the blue, the possibility of low carbon sources for hydrogen coupled with carbon capture and storage. And you see that across the continent, there's a very, very rich supply story for hydrogen. And the small gray dots are the existing hydrogen facilities. You can see there's plenty of existing demand around hydrogen in the US already. And so we're moving ahead with further work with Baringa. We're going to model more of the US, but we started in Texas, and I just want to cover on the next slide why we look to Texas once again. I remember we kind of brought this Baringa and said, here's our problem. We know in Texas that all these things actually exist: the wind, the solar, the liquid fuel generation, a huge network of pipelines, and of course, electrical grid, and all this hydrogen capacity. If we can take the reality in space and time for this mix in Texas and start to make sense of how the hydrogen story will become a greater part of this mix, and indeed solve some of the problems that the state of Texas has faced from an energy point of view, that would be a profound and worthwhile piece of work in and of itself. And so, as I said, we shopped the world. We decided the Baringa was the best place to stop. And we're very pleased with the outcome of the first stage of work. And we're going to keep going with them to further our insights and understanding for the Hydrogen Council on how hydrogen plays an important role in stitching together the energy system of the future. So with that background, I'll turn it back to our friends at Baringa to tell you a bit more about what they've done.
Thanks so much, Daryl. So on the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about all of the various incentives that are doing a tremendous amount to shift the economics on what already had looked like a competitive potential hydrogen industry in Texas. But to build on what Daryl said, first and foremost, Texas and the Gulf Coast are really blessed with an abundant natural resource base. So there's opportunities for all types of clean hydrogen. The state has already had significant success with building out solar and wind resources. It has the largest concentration with the wider Gulf Coast region of fast cycling salt dome storage, attractive geology for various CCS projects, tremendous infrastructure that's export oriented, including deep water ports. So really the state has some ingredients for whatever flavor of hydrogen you're looking at. And to dig a little bit deeper on the IRA, we could spend the entire hour just going through all the nuance of how this could stand to benefit various forms of clean hydrogen. But really just looking at the 10,000-foot view, there's a base rate for what you could expect on both the investment tax credit or the production tax credit, which then could be multiplied up to 5 times, assuming that that facility meets prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements. But then there's even additional bonuses that are possible if the facility hits both domestic content requirements or energy community requirements, which essentially can be bucketed into 3 categories, one being brownfield sites, the second category being based on employment statistics, specifically some around having existing and prior energy industry and employment. And then the third on census tracts where both coal mines may have closed after 1999 or where a coal-fired generating unit was retired after 2009. But on the next slide, we actually get a little bit more into the meat of what the IRA means specifically for the types of projects that we looked at with the Hydrogen Council. And that is a life cycle emissions dependent credit on the production tax credit side, whether that be for green or blue. And again, there's some additional potential nuance here as we and other market participants are waiting to have more clarification around pending components to the IRA, specifically looking at what would be included in those life cycle emissions. What should we think about emissions are counted for clean hydrogen and how much basically clean hydrogen that facility would produce in a year, i.e. the seasonality of production. And lastly, one that has been getting significant attention as of late is what granularity of time matching should we be thinking about? Will this be happening on an annual, a monthly, or an hourly basis, which could stand to have both significant repercussions on the ultimate life cycle emissions of the facility or on how cost competitive it will be. On the next slide, we dig a little bit deeper into what Baringa and the Hydrogen Council looked at specifically in the scope of work. So again, the subsidies that we're looking at are generous and game-changing, and they really shifted the economics from making what would have been prior to the IRA a story that could have been focused around blue hydrogen more than green, now one of more colors, making both types of clean hydrogen competitive at the onset. In general, we also were looking at what capture rates matter on both the blue hydrogen side, whether that be for an ATR or an SMR. And we've also assumed that in some cases that the IRA credits are not extended beyond the initial period in which the act was written. And now I will hand over to Shane to dig even deeper into the system benefits of hydrogen in Texas.
Thanks, Nina. And I think to kick off, if you sort of keep that message in your mind that this is both a blue and a green story, essentially, we think Texas will support almost equal parts blue and green hydrogen production in our scenario. What that means is it could support over 50 gigawatts of renewable hydrogen by 2050 in a highly decarbonized energy system as a result of and accelerated by the IRA. Let me sort of touch on a little bit about how we got to that number, right? Because I think my colleagues have alluded to the fact that we've got leading capabilities as a firm in energy system modeling. So we model the various US power pools as well as the North American gas system. We model it over time, both long term and to the hour. And this allows us to see how these systems can kind of evolve together in a reasonably consistent way, and importantly, in the most economic way to meet a particular decarbonization goal or within the context of a particular broader global scenario. Now, in terms of scenarios here, we've taken Hydrogen Council's view of global hydrogen demand that Daryl talked through earlier. And what that means for Texas is there's up to 16 megatons of hydrogen production possible by 2050. And what we've done is we've modeled how do you produce that 16 megatons most economically by modeling both the power and gas systems and the hydrogen infrastructure you need, and assuming that both those power and gas systems decarbonize relatively deeply, as they will have to be consistent with this level of hydrogen demand. And then spatially, we split Texas into 5 zones, which are the 5 colored dots you see in the chart here. Sorry, there's 4 on the chart here, but we also have a demand zone for Texas. And we model the economically optimal evolution of infrastructure to meet those conditions for producing demand. And what you can see first, number one, is that the IRA really is an accelerator. So we think projects could be cheaper to build in the next 10 years rather than thereafter as a result of this tax credit. The second point is really that different zones have different economics. And what this will mean is that where the levelized cost of electricity is lower, as it is for areas like the Panhandle and the north of Texas, and where there's plenty of sun and wind, correspondingly, the levelized cost of hydrogen would be lower, and we'd expect to see more renewable hydrogen production there. Now, water resource is a major caveat in these zones. These are drought-prone zones, but I think the thing to remember here is that these are also zones that currently produce a lot of oil and gas, which is, in fact, per unit energy, more water intensive than producing renewable hydrogen. So how do we enable this level of hydrogen production? If we move to the next slide, we show a vision of hydrogen transport and storage here. So the first thing to really point out is that pipelines and storage for hydrogen are absolutely critical to enabling Texas to deliver on this potential. While the existing grey hydrogen production that Darrell referred to, Texas being the largest producer of SMR-based hydrogen in North America, that will continue to be located in there, in that Gulf Coast region. But what we'll see is that will turn blue. So we'll have CCS infrastructure enabling that to become low carbon hydrogen. But then in addition to that, the renewable hydrogen production capacity, that will be located far from that demand center, far from that Texas triangle of economic activity over in the east and south and along the coast. And that means we're going to need hydrogen pipelines, which we can retrofit from natural gas pipelines. And that will be the most economic way to move that energy from essentially solar and wind zones down into demand. And this is good news for that infrastructure, because a lot of that infrastructure will come from existing natural gas pipelines. And in this scenario, we do foresee peak gas occurring at some point on this transition. And so there will be a need for those assets to extend their life. Alongside that, though, we'll continue to move natural gas from well to coast for that blue hydrogen production. So you'll see hydrogen pipelines sitting alongside natural gas pipelines. And then finally, if we think about the liquid fuel side of the equation, currently, Texas, in addition to having this mesh of natural gas pipelines running through the state and across into its neighboring states, it also has a mesh of refined oil pipelines, taking fuels like kerosene from the Gulf Coast where they're refined out through into the rest of North America. And what we'll see in the future is that those refined oil pipelines can just as easily move kerosene derived from hydrogen and recycled carbon, acting as simply a drop-in fuel to those pipelines to feed the rest of the country's aviation fuel demand. So then what does that mean for investment? So if we move to the next slide, we think this means an investment opportunity of over $200 billion cumulatively between now and the end of the transition, and that's mostly in production infrastructure. Now, to put that into context, that amounts to about $10 billion per year into new infrastructure. That's equivalent to the today's spend in the chemical industry across all of the US over the last decade. It's equivalent approximately to half of all US investment in wind energy in 2021. And it's equivalent approximately to 1/4 of the value of oil and gas projects that were due for FID in the US in 2022. Now, initially, this investment will be driven by certain use cases in hydrogen. So certain use cases are easier to access now versus others. So we will see it used to decarbonize heavy industry along the Gulf Coast, as well as to decarbonize existing hydrogen production currently using grey hydrogen from methane reformation. In the longer term, we'd expect to see use cases like aviation and shipping, where the cost gap between hydrogen and fossil fuels is a little bit harder to bridge, accounting for the majority of that longer term investment. We'll also see this investment weighted towards production infrastructure, which you can see on the left-hand side of the waterfall chart here. So building more wind, more solar, building electrolyzers, building reformers is going to provide the bulk of that investment opportunity. That being said, there is a material investment opportunity in conversion into e-fuels such as kerosene, into ammonia, into e-methanol, as well as downstream use cases such as hydrogen to power turbines, storage infrastructure, transport infrastructure, and CCS infrastructure. So this is, in a nutshell, how the system will evolve based on the modeling we've done. We're going to move now in the next section over the next 5 to 10 minutes onto the benefits that brings. So as we mentioned earlier in the talk, part of the advantage of doing system modeling like this is you can get at benefits to the system that you can't really get at using a simple levelized cost view of energy. You have to look at how that energy moves around over time and between energy vectors such as hydrogen, electricity, and gas. Now, we've quantified 4 benefits here with respect to Texas, and we've quantified a larger number more broadly across the 3 regions, Texas, Europe, and Japan, but we want to focus on 4 here that are very relevant to Texas. The first is electrolyzer flexibility. So electrolyzers act as a source of flexibility in a power system the same way batteries or gas turbines do. Provided you've got large scale hydrogen storage, you can operate electrolyzers flexibly within reason, acknowledging they'll have some minimum level of demand for hydrogen to meet. And in doing so, you reduce the need for other sources of flexibility within the power system. And we'll touch a bit more on how that works in the following slides. But if we then look at hydrogen peakers, converting power to hydrogen and then back to power tends to seem unintuitive and often tends to make engineers get quite worked up who focus on efficiencies rather than costs. But there is a place for hydrogen to power in a decarbonized system, alongside batteries and alongside CCS and alongside electrolyzers. And again, we'll dive a little bit into why that is in the following slides. Then finally, there is a benefit, as I alluded to earlier, from extending natural gas infrastructure. So Texas has this extensive mesh of gas network linking its wells to its customers, and that'll expand before it shrinks one day, and it will need to shrink one day if we're going to decarbonize. But that means less pipelines and less storage in the long term. Now, if you could repurpose these to hydrogen, we see a few more billion in USD benefit in doing that by extending their asset lives as you slowly transition from peak gas to peak hydrogen. So if we move on to the next slide, I want to focus on the flexibility benefits as they're the more material ones that have popped out of this study, and they tend to be less widely recognized and less understood among industry. The first is the benefit of electrolyzer flexibility. Now, what you see here is the modeling of what a year's worth of power prices might look like in part of Texas. We've taken the Panhandle as an example here. What a year's worth of power prices might look like in 2050. If we assume again that the Texas power system is very low carbon at this point, we've delivered on our hydrogen production potential, and what you see is the prices per day ordered from the highest price to the lowest price day. Now, in one line, you've got a system that has this 50 plus gigawatts of electrolyzer capacity we talked about plugged into the system, and in the other, you don't. You have a slightly different mix of power infrastructure needed to meet decarbonization objectives, but you don't have those electrolyzers involved. And what you see is that the scenario with the electrolyzers, you get much more stable price regime. You get less zero price hours, which equates to less energy dumping from solar and wind assets. You also get less high price hours, which typically equates to higher levels of rent seeking within the system as assets that have the ability to undercut that price generate more profits. Now, this more stable regime also provides more revenue certainty for renewable energy projects, so it makes wind and solar projects more financeable, knowing that power prices are going to be less volatile. Now, what you don't see here is the equivalent view for the other zones in Texas, and you may well be thinking, well, that's all well and good for the Panhandle, where we're going to build loads and loads of solar and loads of wind, and therefore we're going to have price volatility. But actually, you get a very similar answer for Houston, and that's because essentially these zones within Texas they are linked to each other. So what happens in the Panhandle affects prices in Houston. And so then if we move to the next slide, we're going back to this role for hydrogen to power peakers and whether we should be turning power to hydrogen to power. Now, our modeling of the system shows there's distinct roles for different sources of flexibility within a power system. So we see electrolyzers, batteries, gas plus CCS, hydrogen to power, and even potentially some unabated gas playing a role in a highly decarbonized system. The first thing to note is that batteries are a great solution for overnight flexibility, for giving you hours worth of flexibility. They work particularly well with deployment of solar, since that is periodic. And what they don't do is allow you to deal with more prolonged supply-demand imbalances in the system. Carbon capture and storage, particularly when it's bolted onto gas-fired generation, that does provide that longer-term source of flexibility. But it is what we call a high capex, low opex solution. So it needs to be running more often than not. It needs to run for extended periods throughout the year, and it's very expensive to build if it's not run. And that means it's very well suited to delivering predictable flexibility. So a classic example in Texas would be that it's going to be there during the summer peak of energy demand, but when conditions are milder or when there's excess wind and solar output, it can then turn off. And then you have situations where they are much less frequent. We're talking about days, weeks where there is low solar or wind output, high pressure weather systems combined with high demand. And this is where hydrogen to power comes in. It's able to alleviate more irregular but reasonably predictable patches of very tight supply, and ends up running for several weeks of the year. It plays the same role essentially as open cycle gas turbines typically play in power systems today. We call them, again, converse to gas plus CCS, it's low capex, high opex solution. And then finally, you may have some level of unabated gas on the system to deal with even more extreme events where it's simply more economic to keep existing infrastructure operational and ready rather than building new infrastructure for those more extreme events. And if we want to pursue deeper decarbonisation, this plant can also be retrofitted to become hydrogen to power. And with that, I've given an overview again of the system benefits here of flexibility within the Texas power system and within this vision of enabling a highly decarbonised system by 2050. With that, I'm going to pass back to Nina Fay to summarise, I think, what some of the enablers are going to be for making this all happen.
Thank you so much, Shane. So while we've talked at length about the system benefits potential for hydrogen in Texas and the opportunities that are awarded by the Inflation Reduction Act or even the Investment Infrastructure and Jobs Act with the $7 million that it has to support various hydrogen hubs in the US. We also are looking at areas that could bolster an even more robust development of hydrogen. The first is frankly on the permitting side, because ultimately the energy transition is going to necessitate infrastructure that moves the molecules and electrons to actually let someone harness the benefits of hydrogen. And many projects and capital plans are being delayed by permitting and siting issues. And ultimately, this can serve to reduce confidence and delay investment, and in some cases, potentially even defer it. And for some states, permitting might boil down to what we understand to be for water rights, or what we would understand to be just approving state primacy in Class 6 permit applications. We also feel that another pillar to enable more robust development is on the demand side of things. And we recently have seen a release from the Biden-Harris administration that would be looking to help folks invest up to $1 billion in the demand side to support regional hubs. For financing activity, much like what we've seen develop in RNG over the past decade or so, it's going to be the proliferation of long-term offtake agreements that give banks the confidence to not only support financing opportunities from substantiation of revenue streams, but from a risk perspective as well. And then ultimately, we would hope that that would help support more liquid and tradable markets. And then there is some further guidance from the IRS that could help on the supply side as well, whether that be really finally firming up some of the time matching requirements for electrolyzer procurement, i.e. what happens at night when the sun doesn't shine, if the weather isn't conducive to high wind speeds, what is your PPA structure or REC structure going to look like? Will you be procuring that on an hourly basis or an annual basis, and how that might change the cost competitiveness of your project? Tied to that would actually be more practical experience in the procurement strategies for power around some of these electrolyzers, whether you co-develop with someone, you co-site with somebody, or you set up a private use network for power in the case of an area like ERCOT. And then somewhat related to this, depending on how you see the role of a electron versus a molecule, will also be on the power transmission side, because what the IRA does have as a gaping hole is really no incentive structure around a robust development for moving electrons, which could, in a way, help support the development of hydrogen movement as well. With that, I will hand over to Molly for some closing comments around today's session and a poll for our audience.
Thanks very much, Nina, and thanks to all of our speakers, Nina, Shane, and Daryl, for really excellent and insightful presentations there. So you should all have had a poll pop up in front of you. Please take a moment to select an answer, and you'll see the results coming through in the chat in real time, so you can review that as it goes along. If you have any questions as well, please type them into the chat, and then we will be able to submit your questions to the panelists. I'm going to start off though, while you're going through the poll and thinking about your questions, with a couple of initial questions to the panelists. So Nina and Shane, you've explained about the potential for Texas to become a global export powerhouse of low carbon hydrogen, which is really exciting. But the question is, where is that going to be exported to? Europe's emerged as an early mover market. But do you think that Texas or the federal government will adapt green hydrogen regulation that's aligned with that of the EU anytime soon? And if you think so, then what's the foreseeable timeframe for this to happen? Maybe if I start off with Nina, if you have any comments, and then we could go to Shane for a European perspective.
From the US side at this point in time, since we still are awaiting on a lot of the clarification around what some of the nuance behind the IRA will be for these credits, I think that there is a potential for some misalignment as we're in the waiting period for those clarifications. And while ultimately on a state level, we might be waiting a bit longer to see that, we have been hearing rumblings around different time structures around the periodicity of time matching, et cetera, that could make the export market from the Gulf Coast well oriented to be matched up eventually with markets in Europe. But we are unfortunately in a holding period for some of that clarification. And Shane, I'd be interested to hear your perspective on what you see for the importation of the North American molecule.
Thanks, Nina. And I'd agree with everything you said there around there being this sort of holding period. I think kind of tantalizingly, the economics for exporting to Europe look really strong at the moment. Clearly, there's a lot of uncertainty there around technologies such as cracking ammonia back to hydrogen. If we're thinking about ammonia being the primary energy vector for moving that hydrogen from the US to Europe. But we do see projects taking that delivery mode seriously. Projects based in the Gulf Coast that we've advised looking to access demand in Europe, particularly in the fertilizer sector and the refinery sector, where there's proven demand and the strong EU targets. I think in addition to the sort of regulatory barriers on the US side, I think the one barrier that exists on Europe's side is there's a bit of a bias towards renewable hydrogen over low carbon hydrogen. So if you're a low carbon hydrogen project in the US, those EU targets, material and strong as they are less favored towards low carbon hydrogen and tend to speak in what EU speak is termed RFNBOs, or renewable hydrogen.
Thanks very much, Shane and Nina. Really interesting. Daryl, a question for you, if you don't mind. So later this year, the DOE is expected to announce the first round of awardees for up to $7 billion of funding to establish several clean hydrogen hubs across the US. Last week, the DOE has announced a complementary initiative to drive confidence in hydrogen demand with $1 billion in funding that will be defined over the coming months. What's your sense for how the Hydrogen Council's members are feeling about these awards? Are these make or break wins, or is it something else entirely, or is it just priming the pump on investment in a few key areas?
So the Hydrogen Hubs project preceded our IRA, and it's a great idea because it allows us to show some of these system benefits that Shane has been talking about from the modeling, because the synergies can be realized in one geographical area. So that's what's good about these things. I'm not sure all of the proposals that were made in the US were well informed by the quality modeling that Baringa can offer. And so I think there's an opportunity to enhance the efficacy and power of these hubs in the US by applying some of these modeling insights and saying, okay, if you build this right, and if you begin with the end in mind with clear vision, how might you arrange the mix of assets and applications in that particular hydrogen hub? So there's a way to improve the hub idea. But then, of course, IRA offers a whole lot more money than the hub thing does, notwithstanding the recent additional billion. And so lots of attention has been directed in creating hydrogen projects in their own right. And once again, I think sophisticated modeling of the region and the place for these projects and how to maximize some of these broader system benefits is work and time well spent, because as I said, we're beginning with the end in mind. We have a vision of what we're trying to create, and we're building into that vision rather than just putting up projects to harvest government money and make a buck. So I think if we're really intent and earnest on optimizing the value of hydrogen, this modeling kind of work is really critical.
Thanks very much, Daryl. That's really useful. So I see we've got a question from Jeffrey Whittle in the chat. I wonder if, Jeffrey, you can just put in a little bit of a clarification around your question. Unfortunately, I think because of the system we're on, we're not able to unmute you, but if you could type in a clarification, that would be super helpful, and then we can send it to the best person in our team. In the meantime, Shane, a question for you. We've seen a shifting of focus and interest to the US as a result of the IRA, and many of our clients shifting their interests and their resources across to the US. What does this mean for Europe? Are we likely to see interest shift back as policy crystallizes, or do you think that the IRA is such a useful and clear instrument that that's a trend that's set to continue?
Thanks, Polly. Yeah, I think we will see some interest shift back, because I think now that the Delegated Act is finally finalized in Europe and there are clear rules around what it means to produce renewable hydrogen, you are starting to see various support schemes pop up in different countries and in different forms. So we see support schemes popping up in the UK to support decarbonisation of transport, to support concrete levels of gigawatt of electrolyzer capacity. We see the same in Germany, Netherlands, France, Scandinavia. And I think what you'll see over the next probably 1 to 2 years is that extend down to Iberia, where you've got a lot of production potential. I think probably where there's a big area of uncertainty and where neither side of the Atlantic has necessarily got the right answer yet is how to make sure that the pipelines and the storage that you need to make the economics of this work in the medium and long term, how do you integrate that at exactly the right time as your production and as your demand? And I think that whoever solves that first will start to see those hundreds of megawatts or gigawatt projects really get closed and get financed at some reasonable cost.
Thanks, Shane. That's really interesting. Okay, Daryl, I wonder if we can come to you for one of the other questions that's come into the chat then. So Matthew Wildman has asked a question around one concept that I see keep coming up for the argument against hydrogen is to do with surrounding the term exergy and its extremely low energy density compared to traditional natural gas. And what are your thoughts on this, as well as the capex requirements and viability for retrofitting natural gas pipelines? Obviously, that was a big part of this study, and I wondered if you had any thoughts on that you would be keen to share.
Sure. In the current energy system, we have all of these issues as we work across gas, oil, various liquid fuels like kerosene into propane, natural gas. And in the future energy system, I think we need to realize that we're still going to have a mix of tools. It's a different mix of tools, and those have a different exergy profile and a different cost profile. But indeed, all the analysis that you're seeing here do build these things into consideration. Often cost is a way that you get indirectly at the exergy issues. And so I think in as much as we kind of have a 80-20 ratio of molecular systems and electron systems today, it'll be a richer mix of electrons in the future. But it's not going to be a whole lot different than what we have today. Maybe it's 40-60 in favor of electrons, maybe it's 50-50 involved in electrons. But as we work with all these different derivatives of hydrogen and look at the cost profile, then those exergy issues kind of get flushed out. And the earlier question that was raised around how exactly we're going to distribute this, a lot of our modeling from the export and trade point of view takes into consideration the energy intensity and the cost to make ammonia versus synthetic kerosene versus green steel, and the distances that are being covered, and then an optimization of all these factors. And you can see that the new world will pencil out. It'll be quite different than the old world, but we're not overlooking the energy density and exergy issues with hydrogen.
Thanks, Daryl. Nina, do you have any thoughts on that one as well?
Yeah, and I think just thinking about this from a natural gas infrastructure perspective, that the length of the study that we're looking at is going out through time, right, into 2050. And Texas and the wider Gulf Coast region are sitting on a veritable postage stamp of natural gas pipe that in some cases has been delivered for areas that might also not be your lowest break even area over time. So there is a potential for basically conversion of some of that asset base to the degree that those might not be the areas that would be quote unquote en vogue as we move forward, because we do see that there would be certain areas in a non-net zero system that still would be cost advantage versus others if we were going to redeploy that infrastructure for hydrogen use specifically. And then it would be, for the most part, neatly tied in to a lot of very fast cycling salt dome storage capacity as well that would be well suited to that molecule in a future version of the energy system. Shep, any closing thoughts on that?
Yeah, just the last one. I think one of the things that's interesting is when you start to then trace this all the way out towards the ultimate demand and use side. And if you think about something like the decarbonization of heat, and for that I mean space heat, not industrial heat, but the decarbonization of heat, we have a lot of policies in the northeastern states within the U.S. that are driving towards lower carbon, non hydrocarbon type solutions, and yet you've got existing infrastructure for gas on the distribution side that many of the utilities in those places are thinking that they're going to retask to pipe renewable natural gas, RNG, or hydrogen, but sort of without a tremendous amount of supply when you look at those regions of the country. And so this is a place again where sort of thinking about this exergy equation. And I think part of the interesting thing, and this might be a nice tie into the other question I think Shane might address on the efficiency things, is do you have low carbon demand policies where you're going to have a need to retask some infrastructure? And then how do you balance that out, the cost of that out against the efficiency drops as you go across that total system? So Molly, back to you.
Yeah, that's a beautiful segue into the efficiency question. So Thomas Dixon has asked what percentage of original energy potential will remain after all of these energy conversions, i.e. electric to hydrogen to ammonia, etc. This was obviously alluded to earlier on in the presentation. I don't know, Shane, if you had any additional thoughts that you wanted to add in response to that question.
Sure, yeah. I think there's 2 points to make here. One is certainly there is potential to lose a lot of energy if you're doing round trip from electricity to hydrogen and back to electricity, right? I think you do lose something like a third of the energy going from electricity to hydrogen through the electrolyzer. And you again probably lose about half the energy going from a gas, whether it's hydrogen or natural gas, back to electricity via turbine, right? And we've all known that for a very long time. But really, that is okay if you're talking about dealing with price spikes in the power system using hydrogen. So you are effectively producing hydrogen when it's very low cost to do so, and you're using it when it is very high value to do so. And that is why that efficiency loss is okay in certain circumstances, to allow hydrogen to provide flexibility to the power system. That's point number one. Point number two is you don't necessarily lose the energy, right? So I think this is going back to sort of high school chemistry and physics, but it can only be converted from one form to another, right? So we do see projects, particularly in colder climates, where you are recycling that energy. That energy is outputted as low-grade heat and can be used for district heating or for other industrial processes. And a great analogy of this, I think, is the petrochemical industry, where you typically have series and series of heat processes stacked on top of each other that allow you to recycle that heat.
Thanks, Shane. Okay, so we've got a couple of questions here related to grid balancing, which I wonder if Shep, you'd like to take. So when producing hydrogen for grid balancing, such as additional offtake for long duration energy storage projects, we often talk about cycle times like seasonal, monthly, daily, etc. But has Baringa's modelling revealed the time to return on investment for such grid level hydrogen storage projects? Do you have any thoughts around that?
Yeah, I do, and it's interesting because one of the I'll frame this with a bit of a story. Like one of the questions that Daryl and I and others hear frequently in the industry is, wow, this hydrogen story is great. It sounds like everybody's a winner. And if everybody's a winner, are there any losers? And, you know, I think the reality of the integrated system and the benefits that hydrogen can unlock is that the only, you know, technical loser in the equation, and this is really a loser that is probably the hardest part of the energy transition to enable today, is power transmission, right? And so, you know, if we get hydrogen in all of these locations and we can reduce price spikes and we can absorb incremental renewable energy resources locally, then hydrogen can play more of a role in that and sort of offset, if you will, against transmission needs. Which brings up, I think it's Hack's question. Like, then if we're going to use it for those purposes, what do those projects look like in terms of the cycle times, and how will they be used to support intermittent renewable energy arbitrage? And the reality in most markets, whether you look at ERCOT or you look at SPP or MISO in the U.S., the amount of congestion, and there's no surprise with the significant build out in renewable energy resources in locations that weren't where traditional generation was based, the amount of grid congestion is increasing, and it's increasing in areas that we wouldn't expect and in times that we wouldn't expect. And so I could say broadly, so long introduction, but the answer to that question is yes, we've modeled the role that hydrogen can play and what the ROI for those investments looks like in sort of these grid balancing needs. And it's improving as we go forward, as the prospects for connecting enough renewable generation to load centers and to all the electrification, as that becomes trickier and trickier every day. So we'd be happy to follow up on that one specifically, but yeah, it's an important part of the equation, is to think about the different duration for projects and cycle times and how those fit into the economic returns.
Thank you. Okay, I'm conscious we've just got 5 minutes left, so I'm going to give the last question to you, Daryl, if that's okay. So we've heard a deep discussion today around the analysis and the modelling that's been done. But it strikes me that what the market really needs now is actual action. Can you give us a sense from the Hydrogen Council members of how this analysis might be used, and do you see accelerating interest in this space among your membership?
Absolutely. I think this is some of the most important work that we have done so far, and that's why we plan to continue it. We're in a time of massive change. And in times of change, folks need help in navigating to the desired future. We have this rough idea that we want a decarbonized future, but how are we going to get there? And what's the system, the energy system, going to look like as we make that journey, not in one big step, but in many, many steps over the coming decades? And I think modeling is fantastic because it allows you to kind of throw everything at the wall and test our theories and our assumptions and our suppositions and say, is that true? Will that work? Is this optimal? And you can do it all that with, strokes on keys on a computer rather than spending billions of dollars and learning as you go. So modeling saves a lot of money. It paints the picture of the future and the steps to get there. And my urgent concern is there's a huge education journey that some of the most important power system planners and architects need to go through. And I think the modeling tools are a way of enabling them to do that investigation and hypothesizing about the future and find their way into the future that makes the most sense given all these issues and the complexity. It breaks my heart to see all the opinions on the internet around how the energy system should work. And in truth, in any state or province or country, there are a relatively small number of people who deeply understand these systems and how they work, let alone how they'll work in the future. And so we urgently need to get these kind of tools in the hands of the people who are making the decisions, the investment decisions, and planning our energy systems for the future with all this pressure on climate change and carbon mitigation. Those decisions need to be well informed. And I can't think of a better tool than the modeling tools that we've been talking about today to find our way into that future.
Thanks, Daryl. That's a great point to end on. So just to quickly wrap up, I don't know if anyone's been looking at the poll, but it's actually really interesting. It's quite optimistic. So 30% of people think that hydrogen will be bigger than we expect. 56% of people say it has great potential, but only for specific contexts and use cases. So quite an optimistic picture emerging there. So just to wrap up, thank you very much for joining us on this webinar. I hope you found it super interesting and useful. Please stay tuned for future webinars in our Low Carbon Future series. We'll be sharing a recording of this webinar early next week. And if any questions have come up that we haven't been able to answer, we'll hope to be reaching out to you and speaking to you about those. So thank you all for joining, and we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you.